I would imagine that in the room there are points of view that don't necessarily agree with what's been said or the consensus that's been reached. So I believe that it would be informative to listen to other perspectives, other ideas of people who perhaps have strong objections to the general consensus, which is to have a ecological taxation. I can see one hand going up already. It's not so much that I object to the principle, but I have a question. Perhaps I want to extend the scope of what's been said, lateral thinking a little. I belong to the Roosevelt Collective. I believe that today we are, at a European level, negotiating a set of free trade treaties, which will lead to an increase in exchanges between parties around the world, which in turn means more transport, which means when we have more, which says that we'll have more transport. Now, we should ensure that there is no distortion in competition, but local communities will no longer be able to choose local companies when they have other larger multinationals who will be able to outcompete perhaps local enterprises. Now, all of this poses a problem. Therefore, before taxation, before the question of taxation, how are we going to deal with these, the TTP, the free trade agreements, for example, with the US or with Canada, which has just been negotiated? So my question is that before going into taxation, or how should we see fiscal measures against this bigger picture where there are contradictions with what we're trying to achieve environmentally? I think that this could lead to a more general question, which is economic deregulation in external trade and the way globalization works and the link which exists with fiscal measures and taxation, even though it wasn't directly dealt with by our speakers. And that's, for example, the issue of cross-border carbon taxes. Now, perhaps before going into a complete answer, we'll take a few more questions from the floor, and that'll give our speakers some time to think. My question, Véronique Badet. I work at the weekly magazine Pèlerin. Okay, taxation is to generate revenue, taxes, but what for? Today, this morning, I was on a discussion about housing. There's a huge need for investment in renovating housing. Now, how do we find the funds to finance that investment? Is it public funds? Should we channel these revenues for these revolutions? For me, energy transition is a need for investment above and beyond anything else. So are we talking about the same thing, or is taxation about something else? François Hubert, rather than having taxes, yesterday evening we were told that whenever there was a little bit more money to be earned in oil underground, then we'd probably strive to extract it. Shouldn't it be necessary on a world level to globalize, pool fossil energy resources on a global scale in order to have an overall world tax pulled together with a supranational institute which sets a price for fossil fuels, which is then uniformly which increases uniformly, and then would solve the energy problem and would ensure that revenues, this comfortable revenue, can be used to resolve the various problems which exist in terms of climate change and correction of imbalances, etc. One more question. I'd like to come back to the question about the cross-border tax. My question, perhaps the Swedish example could give us an element of an answer to this. What are the effects of delocalization and the impact of environmental measures? I can see that the Swedish approach was to set up an environmental tax by offsetting it against other taxes, reducing other taxes. Or did you have cases where companies decided to leave the country because they weren't taxed as heavily? So we have 4 questions. There are 2 questions, I believe, tie into the issue of taxation and free trade, international trade. One question on redistribution of fiscal revenue, and one question which is alternative taxation, which is pooling of global resources, global fixing of a global price, and redistribution of the revenue. Okay, there are 4 basic questions. The first question, the question was raised in different ways. The last way you raised it was the best, in my view. How does national taxation fit into the global picture? The problem today is economic mechanisms work on a global scale, and taxation is implemented at a national scale. And not even at a European scale, because Europe as an entity doesn't have much power in the field of taxation, unless we're talking about Eurovignette. It's limited to about that. In terms of freedom of movement of people and goods, that is one of the pillars of the European Union, but only takes into account to a very small level externalities, not like Switzerland, which can take into account the full impact of externalities. Now, personally, I don't see any solution in the short to medium term, because member states are absolutely against loss of any sovereignty in the field of taxation. So for me, there is no short or medium-term solution to that. The second question from Mrs. Badet, I think it's another fundamental issue. We haven't spoken it because of lack of time. We have to distinguish 2 types of taxation, one which is incentivizing and the other one which is revenue generating. In my view, they are antagonistic. If you want an incentivizing tax, then you need a very narrow threshold, very high levels of taxation, and then a substitute product. Take a basic example. If fear is a source of cancer, if butter was found to be causing cancer, then we would put a tax on butter, but then reduce it on margarine. They would shift their consumption then to margarine and non-cancer generating products. With revenue generating taxes, they're low taxes, but across a broad range of products, but then there is no incentive. So the distinction that I've just drawn is somewhat artificial, because you can, and perhaps drawing on the German example, where experience shows us that we have this double dividend phenomenon, and seems to have worked in Germany. In the case of energy, why does it work? Well, because energy is something that everybody needs. So when you increase taxes adaptation behavior is assistance over the long term. So taxation is 90% of the environmental revenue. Now, from my point of view, I prefer incentivizing eco-taxation, even though there is a lot of objection, because people believe that revenue is required to finance the energy transition. That's the point of view of NGOs. For example, earmarking. NGOs say that we need an agency for the reaffectation. But when we've got over €1 billion in debt, the priority is to reduce the debt and the servicing of that debt. Otherwise, there'll be no money left to help the environment. Now, that's another question, and we don't all agree upon. On the issue of globalization of fossil energies, I don't think that's very realistic. And you have different types of fossil fuels. The prices are different. The taxation, the tax regimes will be different. Now, the impact of taxation on delocalization, yes, that's important. There have been many studies on the matter which show generally that the impact of environmental taxation in countries such as France is very low on competition, on competitiveness of countries. And it only represents a fraction of their social contributions. Now, of course, some companies will say that this is being added to a already heavy burden of social contributions. And so the impact, the overall impact of the environmental tax on delocalization is actually quite low. What I do believe is true, however, is the impact of delocalization due to the cost of energy, of which taxes are part. But in France, this isn't so much the case because, as you know, energy is very cheap. With Finland, we are amongst the cheapest countries for energy, which poses other problems, which means that the price signals being sent out are very weak, and the people are not incentivized to consume less energy, contrary to countries like Germany, where it's very expensive.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I can add on a couple of issues here. First of all, when I'd like to make it clear, when we talk about an environmental tax, of course, a good environmental tax is actually the one that will cease to exist because it has a purpose. It wants to punish something, and when that doesn't exist anymore, then the tax shouldn't be there. And of course, that means that you get less revenue, and that's why you need to complement environmental taxes on energy also with a broad, stable energy tax on a broad tax base. So preferably on all energy carriers based on the same amount of money per gigajoule per energy content. And we are working in that direction in Sweden to separate the tax systems. Then to some other points that was raised about a global price on CO2, a global CO2 tax. Well, that would really be the best idea, of course. I don't think ever there will be an agreement on that, not in our lifetime anyway, and definitely not on how to spend it. So I think that's really utopia, something that we can't achieve. Now on to that someone raised the border tax adjustments. Well, Sweden is a country that traditionally it's a small economy, very export-oriented, so we very strongly believe in free trade. So we are not particularly keen on border tax adjustments. But on the other hand, we have a heavy export-oriented industry, so that's why we choose to have these two levels of taxation. A lower level, still high internationally, but a lower level for those subject to international competition. And by striking that balance, we have been able to make good environmental results by still preventing any significant carbon leakage. And we think that is a good solution. So really. Thank you.
I'm not against border tax adjustment. I think there's a certain fairness that can be found. As for the allocation of resources, that's a very important subject, and Guillaume, I would disagree with Guillaume on that. I'd be up for having within the domestic tax system taxes linked to the environment, because you need to pay these taxes one way or another, and I would rather pay them on pollution, on natural resources in favor of an energy transition, rather than pay them through my work or through my company. So in between the two, I would favor tax based on the environmental impact and energy impact of the market. But this is at least down to the fact that there are many options, and politicians have many options. You can reduce public debt, which is a key issue in Italy. You can transfer taxation. We can make use of the positive effects of environmental taxation. And as Guillaume mentioned, we're asking environmental policymakers, energy transition policymakers, we're asking much more of them than other policymakers, which is a tradition of the environmental community, wanting to be transparent and participative. We try to justify and demonstrate everything to everyone and get everyone's agreement. And surely in transport or traditional energy or defense policy, the requirements are not so stringent, and you need to think maybe of a fairness among policy and among different types of politics. So the idea of overall management of energy prices is a very interesting idea. It could be a long-term idea, but there are many problems because there is a worldwide market, but the markets are never fully worldwide because oil costs are marginal. You can only act on the marginal part of the cost, and you can never have a single management of the market which is compartmentalized by countries, zones, and regions. I had prepared 2 slides which could be useful to see what happens at European level. If we at European level could manage to do things together, that would be a huge step forward. We have a common economic policy. We have a right to look at each other in different countries, and we don't have a common tax policy, however, which I think is one of the reasons for the failings of the EU. We need more Europe and therefore more common taxation, and not give up on the common budgetary and economic policies. The problem of unanimity in tax decisions at European level is a terrible one. All we need is for one of the 28 member states to be opponents, such as our British friends who are all up for sovereignty in this regard. All they need is to oppose a measure for it not to be passed. We thought the carbon tax was ready at European level because of Jacques Delors' work and Alberto Maia, who was an Italian economist. It was all ready for Rio 92, and yet a British finger was raised, and other national interests came into play, and we arrived to the developing countries with a much less credible and strong position. It's no surprise that the ETS market of Kyoto was introduced in Europe. It's because we didn't manage to introduce a carbon tax, which required unanimity, whereas the market of the emissions market is considered an environmental measure, and it has a normal procedure by majority vote, even though it's a market-based instrument. Nevertheless, we don't necessarily need fiscal unanimity. We can take autonomous measures, national measures, and make the most of the margins provided by institutional mechanisms of enhanced cooperation. Schengen or the Euro are models of this type of cooperation. We've institutionalized them afterwards. We need a minimum of 9 countries of the 28 that can work together within the European framework. You can also think of coalitions of the willing, or like-minded countries. It has negative connotations after the experiments in Iraq and so on, but you can also call them like-minded countries, so countries that can work together. With some colleagues, we saw 4 sectors where we could work among willing countries. Aviation, for example, the kerosene tax exemption gives an advantage to the aviation sector, and there's no reason that we should give them such an advantage at international level. It's an international convention of 1945 of the International Civil Aviation Organization. They prepared the future very well at the time. Tourism can be justified. There can be cooperation in that field. Excessive use of pesticides and fertilizers, that has a major impact on the use of water and on energy, and obviously CO2 taxation, where several countries, Sweden is one of the trailblazers, but many other countries are making efforts, such as Great Britain, in parts of the market that aren't covered by the ETS. International treaties, the free trade treaties, as was mentioned, are a threat. And they are on the borderlines of our conversation today, but it isn't a priority. You need to work on all these levels to the same extent. I was in Brussels because at the presidency of the Council in Europe, we have prepared a conference for the global conference on we've prepared the global conference on biodiversity. So how difficult it is for our 28 countries to find a common position. And so we decided to double international aid to development in terms of biodiversity, and everyone went home happy, satisfied. But as an economist, I'll see that objective of doubling aid to biodiversity at international level. I'll see that there's no responsibility set for each country. It's an overall objective. We need to meet it together, but there's no accountability for each country. And a country such as Denmark or Sweden or Norway, which already gives 1% of its GDP to development aid, why should it double its development aid? They already make a major effort. A country like Italy that donates 0.14% of its GDP could make an effort, but that's difficult for that country at a time of economic crisis. But so finding ways of building worldwide consensus is very difficult, but we need to work on that. The climate conference in Paris, late 2015, in Lima in 2014, we'll also be in Korea in October. So we need to work on all levels, be it tax and ecological reform, energy transition policies, the COP. We need to take all the trains going in the right direction. I'm going to take a series of questions now. Fabien Toquet from the French Red Cross. Guillaume Saintny mentioned the need for predictability and progressiveness of green taxation. How did the Swedes manage to have that predictability in spite of your changing governments? Do your institutions allow for long-term policies? What's your secret? Their elections are next Sunday, so be careful, Susan. So Didier Venin, I work for EDF, I work for the Greater Paris region. I was very interested to hear your words on considering that environmental policies are more or less a Trojan horse with regard to social justice or vulnerability, I've somewhat different opinion, and I just want to feed it into the debate, because I worked on our solidarity policy within EDF and GDF. I get the feeling that there are other public policies are divesting themselves of their responsibilities in that field, and it's environmental policies that have taken on that burden. You didn't mention Trojan horse, Mr. Saint-Denis, but to me it's the feeling of a collective divestment of responsibility, and the fact that it's a burden on others now. Now, Mr. Saint-Denis, in what you were saying about tax reductions, do you include the CSPE, the public service contribution of electricity, which represents 1/3 of the bills for households, and various political choices were made to that end 10 to 15 years ago when that mechanism was put in place? The share of that contribution for that was quite large, and yet it's become a smaller and smaller share because there was a public policy in France which was to subsidize renewable energies, which has had an impact on the message that's given to people. And as for your the final question, taxation on international trade, some of the issues we're facing with the electricity trade is the increasing power of data centers, IT servers, which use a lot of electricity, and we use them several times a day whenever we use our mobile phones, such as the person who's sitting right in front of me. Whenever we use an IT server, that uses energy, and so there should be taxation, but there's nowhere to situate the taxation, not even within a country. So how could we set up a taxation system? And I'm thinking of a recent American study. For example, if you use Facebook today, you produce as much CO2 as if you were preparing a cup of tea using a kettle, which is a major tax issue, one could say. Third question? Okay.